So my name's Ben Grant. I'm a lecturer here in the Department for Continuing Education in English Literature. I'm going to be talking today about the art of brevity in literature. So yeah, it's probably a good idea to start by thinking about what we mean by this word, brevity. So what do you understand by brevity? What words would you associate with the word brevity? Shortness, yeah. Succinct, yeah. Pithy, yeah. Yeah, so I think the first thing that comes to mind. So let's have a look at the Oxford English Dictionary definition of the word brevity. Then and we can see there that that first thing that we think about is shortness, isn't it? Especially as applied to time, so a brief moment, and that carries over into our understanding of brevity in literature, so the being short in speech or writing. So we might think there of short literary forms. If it's short, then it has brevity. But then the definition goes on, this contraction into few words, conciseness, terseness, and you were suggesting there things like pithy, succinct, which I think is synonyms to the word concise, aren't they? So that's another way of thinking about brevity. So perhaps something that is short doesn't necessarily have brevity. It's got to have some other quality as well. We might also think then that maybe something isn't all that short, does have that quality of brevity, that it can be pithy, concise, succinct, without necessarily being all that short. So it takes the idea of brevity in different directions. But I think we need to also think about then this word concise, don't we? And sort of pithy, succinct, and so on. And what does that mean? Well, it comes from the Latin word concidere, to cut up or to cut to pieces. Of speech or writing expressed in few words, brief and comprehensive in statement, not diffuse. So in terms of the etymology of the word, we might then think of that as a cutting away of everything that's inessential, that's not necessary, that's superfluous in some way, so leaving only the most essential point or argument or image or whatever that might be, so the few words. But I wonder if that quite exhausts what we think about as being brevity in literature, just that idea of the most essential. And I don't think it does really. So I put up the second definition here of concise, which the Oxford Dictionary actually says is an obsolete use of the word, but I think it is relevant to thinking about concision in literature. And that's containing much in little space, small and compact. So this idea of compactness, that there's a huge amount put into very little space, and I think really does capture what we often think about in brevity in literature. And so to take this forward, let's have a look at what a couple of influential writers of brevity have had to say about their practice as writers. The first one is the French writer Joseph Joubert, and he said, "If there be a man tormented by the cursed ambition to put a whole book into a page into a phrase, and that phrase into a word, I am that man." So, I think this relates really well, doesn't it? That second definition of concise, that idea of containing much in little space, small and compact. Joubert's tried to pack a whole book into a single word. He really wants to say everything at once. And actually, he talks about this as a cursed ambition, and Joubert didn't manage to publish anything in his life. He just wrote these journals with all these little sentences in the journals, but they were collected after he died by the famous French writer Chateaubriand and published as a collection, and this really made his name. And he's a brilliant writer, actually, of short forms. And I think it's important, actually, that he wrote in journals, and journals, notebooks, and diaries have been an important source of innovation, really, in literary brevity. So we don't often think of those as being literary forms, but they are very important. The second writer, probably more likely to have heard, was a German philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, who also wrote very kind of concise writing. And he said, "My ambition is to say in 10 sentences what everyone else says in a book, what everyone else does not say in a book." But it's strikingly similar to Joubert here, isn't it, at the start? He wants to pack a whole book into a really short space. But then he goes on, what everyone else does not say in a book. And I think that's really getting at something there, that what he's suggesting is that you can say something in 10 sentences which you can never say in a book. That you kind of need brevity in order to be able to get at something which you couldn't do otherwise. So I think that's important to bear in mind when thinking about brevity in literature. Well, the first example I want to look at is this one, which is by the Japanese poet Shinpai Cassano, who's famous for his frog poems. And this is one of those. It visually represents a frog hibernating in a hole over the winter. And it consists simply of the title hibernation and an enlarged full stop. So you can't get much shorter than that, can you? But I think as well as being very short, I think this has a lot to say about the role of brevity, the way that brevity functions in literature. The first thing that we notice about it is perhaps not so much the full stop as the white space. The page, it's almost entirely white space, isn't it? And short forms and short poems are always, have a lot of white space around them. But they're also surrounded by white space in a more abstract sense, in that they're pointing towards much more that they don't say. So we can think about that white space as a kind of space of the unknown. And I think it's interesting here that the poem takes the form of a full stop, and it makes us think of that punctuation mark as being itself a kind of hibernation between one sentence and the next, so rather than a definitive ending. And hibernation is also, I think, a telling way to think about brevity, as a paring down of life to the minimum, ready to launch into activity in the spring. In this sense, a hibernating animal resembles a seed, and short forms are often compared to seeds, which can be widely dispersed and take root in many different contexts. My own interest in brevity led me to write this book, The Aphorism and Other Short Forms. And you'll see that I chose as a cover image for that book one of seeds, of dandelion seeds being just floating in the wind. I thought this captured very well the short form, not only the smallness of the short form, that's small and compact, but also its tendency to be widely dispersed and to take root in different contexts and places. I was motivated to write this book because it seemed to me that there was a whole hidden tradition of short forms, not only in literature but in other kinds of writing as well, particularly science, philosophy, and religion, and that these short forms kind of transcended those different kinds of writing, but also different national boundaries, different linguistic boundaries. I thought that there was a need for a book which would bring that tradition much more into the open. So when we look at short forms, we're kind of confronted by a bewildering array of seemingly overlapping forms that you might hear of, and I've listed some of them here. Proverb, aphorism, epigram, maxim, fragment, gregoria, and haiku. I'm going to be looking at those in the talk, and I've added an etc. box because there's a lot more that you might think of, and you might want to think for yourselves of what other short forms you might want to include in that box. Well, the word aphorism tends to be used now to refer to short forms generally, and I think it is useful to think of people like Joubert and Nietzsche as writing within an aphoristic tradition, within a tradition of these kind of short forms. That's why I called my book The Aphorism and Other Short Forms. However, all these names also point towards fundamentally different ways of thinking about brevity. And we could also think of short forms as being a kind of laboratory for the development of innovations in literary brevity. So these can then be applied in longer works as well. So it's a good way of thinking about different ways of thinking about literature. So let's start with the proverb, which is the one everyone's heard of on this list, I'm sure. I mean, what proverbs can you think of? What do you think of as being a proverb? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, they seem quite different, don't they, those proverbs? But yeah. Any others?
The early bird catches the worm.
Yeah. Yeah, so we've all heard of these. Does anyone know any in other languages, not in English? That
Carpe diem.
Carpe diem, yeah. Yeah. Hmm?
When you just thought of something, when you should have said it before.
Yeah, so what language is that from?
My accent terrible.
Hmm? Yeah, so I think that's interesting, isn't it? It was in English, everyone kind of knows, but there was another language, you say, yeah, what does that mean? I think that kind of gets at something about the proverb. I mean, we all have a stock of proverbs and proverbial expressions in our mother tongue, certainly, and I don't think you can function in a language on an everyday basis without knowing at least some proverbs and proverbial expressions. They're very much a part of oral culture, aren't they? And they circulate in the spoken language. They're also described as being a kind of folk wisdom, and we might think of them as being ancient, but I think it's also the case that proverbs are always coming into being. One is, I can think of as "a picture paints 1,000 words," which started life as an advertising slogan, but it's now kind of has a sort of feel of a proverb to it, doesn't it? So yeah, another way that we tend to think of them as containing a particular moral or a particular piece of truth or wisdom, but actually I think it's also the case that their meaning very much depends on the context in which they're used. So it's not necessarily a fixed meaning, but it varies according to who's using it, how they're using it, where they're using it. And proverbs can often be metaphorical, though this isn't necessarily the case. I think this is a great description of the proverb by the Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe. And he said, "Proverbs are miniature tales. They're the building blocks, if you like, of tales. They're tales refined to their simplest form, because a good proverb is a short story. It is very short indeed." So Achebe really does think of the proverb as being a literary form, doesn't he, as a short story. And he actually described them as being the great tradition of the Igbo people to whom he belonged. And he incorporated a lot of proverbs into his novels. I think what he says about the proverb here is also brilliantly illustrated in this painting by Peter Bruegel the Elder, called Netherlandish Proverbs. And it looks like a single scene, but it's actually built up like building blocks of 126 Dutch proverbs, which are all illustrated by these little vignettes. And this is one of them, which to be able to tie even the devil to a pillow. So we get the sense here of a little story, don't we? A moment out of a story. But also, I think we get that sense of the surreal quality, and the saying about if we see proverbs in another language, they look very strange and surreal and off kilter, and we sort of lose sight of that in our own language. I think, but that kind of paradoxical quality to them is important. Well, the next form I'd like to look at is the aphorism. As I said, this can be used as the term for short forms generally, but it also more specifically means a kind of short saying which encapsulates a truth of some kind. I suppose, most simplistically, what distinguishes a proverb from an aphorism is that the proverb is anonymous. We don't know who said it, whereas an aphorism has an author attached. We kind of know who the author of that was. Although that kind of means that what we think of as an aphorism can become a proverb if we forget who said it originally, and it kind of becomes a proverb. So something like, "Fools step in where angels fear to tread." Does anybody know who said that? Not Shakespeare. Yeah, that's right, Alexander Pope. But yeah, so it might be a quotation if we know that it's by Pope, but it might have become a proverb if we kind of forget. And I think most people don't know who said that originally. So aphorisms also tend to be thought of as being words of wisdom, and they're also often enigmatic or paradoxical in nature. Let's look at a few aphorisms. So the first one is by Shakespeare, from his play Julius Caesar. That's, "There is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries." I think having looked at that sort of definition of the proverb by Achebe, I think we can see here as well that this is also like a little story, isn't it? This is the story of life, and it's also very metaphorical. So there's a strong overlap between the proverb and the aphorism. I mean, William Shakespeare, you said that, although I know it's Shakespeare, you generally, if you hear something that sounds like a quotation, it's probably Shakespeare, and I think that's the case in the English language. He's given so many proverbs and proverbial expressions and quotations and aphorisms to the language. I mean, another interesting thing, though, is that he didn't sit down and write these on their own, did he? They're in the course of a longer work, and that's true of very many aphorisms, that they're taken from longer works. So people collect them, extract them, and publish them in collections. So that's kind of how they're sort of taken out of context. So a way of thinking about the aphorism then is how it functions in the longer work to which it belongs, the relationship between the short form and the longer work. I mentioned that Achebe kind of uses a lot of proverbs in his novels. Well, what's the relationship between the proverb and the novel? What roles do the proverbs play in the novels? Are interesting questions to ask about the aphorism. The next aphorism is this one by the Polish aphorist Stanislaw Lech. And he said, "Truth is hardest to find when anything could be the truth." I chose this one because I think it speaks very powerfully to the present day, doesn't it? As our concerns about fake news and misinformation, propaganda, and so on. And I mean, Lech was writing in communist Poland, but I think it's speaking to us in the present day, and this is important with short forms and aphorisms that we kind of interpret them in the context of our own life, don't we? We incorporate them into our own life. I mentioned as well that the aphorism is like encapsulates a truth. But it's also the case that aphorisms are often leading us to question what truth is, and they're thinking about the nature of truth, and that's certainly the case with this one. Next one is, the only way to atone for being occasionally a little overdressed is by being always absolutely overeducated. Well, it won't be surprising to see this is by Oscar Wilde, and Wilde is a great writer, but he's also a great producer of his own persona, that of the decadent artist par excellence. And I mentioned that aphorisms differ from proverbs in that they have an author, whereas proverbs are anonymous. And an important effect of this is that aphorisms are often closely associated with the person who wrote them and the personality of that person. Oscar Wilde's an excellent example of this. His aphorisms therefore often reinforce his persona, and that's certainly the case with this one. Wilde was always overdressed and always absolutely overeducated himself. But the kind of aphorisms that Wilde excelled at are probably better described as epigrams, and I think these forms kind of shade into each other. The epigram actually began life as a short poetic form in ancient Greece and Rome, but we now tend to think of it more as a single sentence. But either way, what defines the epigram is it has a kind of turn, a kind of surprising twist to it, or a sharp point is another way of thinking about that. We might think here of it as a surprising turn from overdressed to overeducated in this. I mean, the epigram is also humorous, and it's particularly associated with the kind of humour known as wit. This is a more traditional kind of poetic epigram by the American writer Dorothy Parker. "If with the literate I am impelled to try an epigram, I never seek to take the credit. We all assume that Oscar said it." Well, I think this really very brilliantly and wittily captures this idea of Oscar Wilde having so successfully created a persona that's identified with the very form of the epigram. So, if we see an epigram, we associate that instantly with Oscar Wilde. I mean, it's part of Wilde's brilliance, I think, that. But Parker herself was very well known as an aphorist and a wit. But that's an unusual reputation for a woman to have. And you might have noticed that almost all of the best-known aphorists and epigrammists are actually men. And I think this quote perhaps gives us some insight into why that might be the case. It's by Elizabeth Montague, who was herself a famous wit and also a leading blue stocking in the 18th century. And she wrote, "It is often said that wit is a dangerous quality. It is there meant that it is an offensive weapon that may attack friend as well as enemy, and it is a perilous thing in society. But wit in women is apt to have other bad consequences. Like a sword without a scabbard, it wounds the wearer and provokes assailants. I'm sorry to say the generality of women who have excelled in wit have failed in chastity. Perhaps it inspires too much confidence in the possessor and raises an inclination in the men towards them without inspiring an esteem, so that they are more attacked and less guarded than other women." Well, I think this passage is very witty in itself, but it also draws attention to the associations of that form of humour with swordplay, which was very prominent in the 18th century. This is also captured in the idea of the epigram as having a sharp point at the end. And in French, that turn in the epigram is la pointe, and in Spanish it's agudeza, which also means sharpness. So what Montague is suggesting here is that to engage in this kind of sport is considered to be unworthy or unladylike. And so to have a reputation as a wit is to lose one's reputation as a woman. Given the close association of wit with short forms like the aphorism and the epigram, it seems to be the case that these forms feed into and feed off of gender stereotypes in a way which is literally physically dangerous for women, Montague seems to be suggesting here. And it's true of the proverb as well, all the misogynistic proverbs. So it's not surprising then that women have felt excluded from these forms of literary brevity. And realising the misogyny inherent in this kind of humour might lead us to question what we see as being a good example of an aphorism, or of literary brevity more generally. And I mean, I suppose, this was in the 18th century, and I think things have changed since then. But I was quite struck a couple of weeks ago, there was a prize given for the best joke at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. I don't know if you saw this, and of the 10 shortlisted people, only one of them was a woman. And I think they tended to have this kind of humour. They're all about wordplay and puns and so on. And I wonder if there's something still gendered about that kind of humour in those short forms. Well, the next form is the maxim, which is closely related to the aphorism and the epigram. And actually, the Oxford English Dictionary definition of aphorism gives maxim as a synonym for that word. But it's also a more specific genre with its own origins and history and tradition. And it began in the literary salons of Ancien Régime Paris, and it was particularly popularised by this man, François de la Rochefoucauld. And in 1664, he published a book called Moral Reflections or Sententiae and Maxims. And this book led to a real craze for the maxim across Europe and in Britain as well. And it's only after the publication of that book that people started to sit down and write kind of collections of short forms. This was the first example of that, really. Before then, people would collect them out of longer works, but there wasn't really a tradition of sitting down and writing them. So it's a really important book in the history of literary brevity. These are some examples of the maxim from that book. Philosophy easily triumphs over past ills and ills to come, but present ills triumph over philosophy. Our misdeeds are easily forgotten when they are known only to ourselves. And our virtues are usually only vices in disguise. I think you can see there's a kind of turn in the maxim as well, isn't there? I mean, that last one, our virtues are usually only vices in disguise. La Rochefoucauld used that as the epigraph to his book, and in fact that's the first example of an epigraph in the whole of literature. So the maxims are about the human condition most often. They're kind of about human psychology. And they're also, these might seem to you quite cynical, I guess, or if not cynical, at least they're going against conventional wisdom, aren't they? They're sort of surprising in some way. They strike us as being true, but also they surprise us, or they unsettle us in some way. Another thing, they've often been described, at the time they were described as the proverbs of the educated class. So I mentioned that there's a difference between the proverb and the aphorism, and that the proverb is anonymous, whereas the aphorism has an author. Another important distinction is that the proverb is seen to be folk wisdom, wisdom of the people, whereas the maxim, the aphorism, the epigram are more aristocratic forms. So these short forms are very much bound up with questions of class. Well, the next short form on the list, I think, is taking literary brevity in a very different direction. The forms that we've looked at so far, the proverb, the aphorism, the epigram, and the maxim, are all self-contained, aren't they? But a fragment is a piece of something by definition. So it's not really defined by shortness. A fragment could be of any length, and it's also not really defined by concision. What really defines the fragment is that it's incomplete, There's something missing from it. So what's it doing on my list then? Well, for one thing, short forms often are fragments. Quotations are fragments of longer texts. We can also think of early Greek philosophers like Heraclitus and Pythagoras, and their works only survived in the form of fragments of longer works. And those texts have had a big influence on the later development of short forms. In the Romantic period, though, which is the late 18th to the early 19th century, people started to think about fragments in a different way, and they started to deliberately produce fragments. And they also thought of texts like collections of short forms, like La Rochefoucauld's collection of maxims, as not so much being independent texts, but as being fragmentary works. So a different way then of thinking about brevity. And the person who wrote about this most was the German writer and philosopher Friedrich Schlegel. And he said many of the works of the ancients have become fragments. So he's thinking about those, early Greek philosophers, Heraclitus, Pythagoras, and so on. But then he goes on, many modern works are fragments as soon as they are written. Well, most obviously there, he's thinking of the fact that in this period people wrote and published fragments, and two good examples of that are Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Kubla Khan, A Vision, which is probably the most famous literary fragment of all, and John Keats's Hyperion, a Fragment. But I think Schlegel's also getting at something else here. He's kind of suggesting that modern works are written in the spirit of the fragment, so as if with the sense that they will always be incomplete in some way, that they're not kind of rounded off and completed. There isn't the sense of them being a kind of complete form. I've put up there a picture of Tintern Abbey, the ruins of Tintern Abbey in Wales, to illustrate the fact that there was a considerable vogue in the Romantic period for ruins. People would go and visit ruins, write about them, draw them. And I think this taste for fragmentary writing, for the fragments, is part of that wider aesthetic. So you can think of a fragmentary text as being a ruined text in some way. So it's part of that Romantic aesthetic. So in the Romantic period then, brevity became more associated with the fragment than with forms like the maxim, the epigram, and the aphorism. What was emphasised was therefore incompletion. And what I think is crucial here is that white space around the short form thereby becomes a space of interpretation. If it's incomplete, then it's up to the reader to fill in what's missing, so to bring something to the text and to supply what's missing. And I think it's that notion which was extended to the idea of literature more broadly. So the literary text is one which is by definition subject to endless interpretation. So it's incomplete, and it has brevity necessarily in this sense, regardless of its length. Well, the next form I want to look at is the Gregaria. Has anyone heard of the Gregaria? He looks, hopefully. No Spanish people in the audience? No. Well, if you were Spanish, you might have heard of it. It is a Spanish word, and it means a kind of, hubbub or a babble of sound. It also refers to the sound that piglets make running behind their mother. So it was a rare word even in Spanish until it was taken up by this man, this Spanish modernist writer, so early 20th century, Ramon Gómez de la Serna, who's more popularly just known as Ramon. And he used the word Gregaria to refer to his own very specific kind of short form, which he wrote, but he also found these in other works. These are some examples of the ones that he wrote. So the giraffe is like a periscope for seeing the plane's horizon. The moon manages to get across the sky undamaged because it is marked fragile on the other side. And he was such an aged painter that all his paintbrushes had gone bald. Well, I think these are quite different, aren't they? There's some of the ones that we've been looking at so far. And I think they're very metaphorical, though, which is something we've seen already. And they're also humorous, but in a different way, I think, than the epigram and the maxim. And he actually defined the Gregaria as humour plus metaphor equals Gregaria. That was one of his statements. I mean, Ramon actually saw these as capturing small and fleeting kind of insights into the world. So they've just kind of come to him, these fleeting insights. And he also saw them as kind of fragments of the world, kind of small little fragments of the world. So they're fundamentally different from forms like the maxim, which purports to contain a kind of hard kernel of truth or wisdom, something kind of eternal. And, Ramon hated the maxim, and he really hated La Rochefoucauld. He kind of defined himself against La Rochefoucauld, that he thought had kind of corrupted the whole idea of brevity and the whole short form. So he was particularly celebrating the instantaneous and the fleeting, and in this he was similar to many other modernist writers. The aspect of brevity which was picked up almost strongly at this time was the extreme brevity of the instant or the passing moment. So if we think back to that first definition of brevity, the shortness, especially as applied to time, we can maybe think of the modernist writers trying to make the short form coincide with that definition of brevity. So trying to make the short form itself like a kind of fleeting instant, a moment of time. And one way of thinking about that moment is as a kind of photograph or a snapshot, and photography has a big influence on the development of short forms in the 20th century. And the final short form I want to look at has often been compared to the photograph. It also had a considerable influence on modernist writers, including Ramon. And that's the short poetic form of the haiku, which originated in Japan. And it was turned into a really independent poetic form by this person, Matsuo Basho, who was a 17th century Japanese writer. He was also a traveller, and he kind of developed these haiku as a way to capture sort of fleeting impressions on his journeys. So you can see why he would have an influence on modernist writers, as kind of trying to capture those moments. Well, having started with a Japanese poem about a frog, I can't resist kind of looking at the most famous haiku of all, which is this one by Basho. The old pond a frog jumps in, plop. And you might have come across other versions of this. It's been translated in many different ways. I think we can see that is kind of capturing an impression. It's a moment which is subjective and a subjective experience, but also an objective scene kind of combined in one. As well as being that, though, it's a very rule-bound form, the haiku. And the most obvious fundamental rule is it has to have a 5-7-5 structure. So it's 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables, which you're never going to capture in translation, so no one tries to. But in Japanese, it has to have that. So if we look at the Japanese, furu ike, old pond, ya, and I'll come back to the ya, kawazu, which is frog or frogs, and that's quite important, I think. It tends to be translated as frog, but in Japanese, there's no difference between singular and plural. Tobi komu, leaps in, mizu no oto, sound of water. So old pond, ya, frog or frogs, leaps in, sound of water. And another rule of the haiku is it has to have a season word. So it's a word which tells you which season we're in. And in this case, that's frog. Mating frogs are associated with spring. So it's telling us that that's the season that we're in. And the final rule is it has to have a cutting word. Kireji in Japanese, Kireji. And that's that word ya, which doesn't have any meaning at all. It's simply there to cut the poem in two. And I think this is really interesting if we think back to that etymology of concision. There's something to do with cutting in pieces. That's at the very heart of this very distinctively Japanese poetic form, this idea of cutting, that the poem is kind of cut in two. But that cutting, it also juxtaposes, it brings together two different things. So it's kind of a cutting and a combining at the same time. So yeah, I mean, another thing we can say about this is, as a very rule-bound form, I think the haiku really well illustrates this idea that I started with, that, you have to, that brevity allows you to get at something which you couldn't get at otherwise, and trying to think through all those rules, you're kind of able to say something that you wouldn't be able to say in any other way. It's enabling in some sense, I think, that those rules, although you might think they'd be far too constraining, you couldn't possibly say anything, that it kind of allows you to get at something. So having looked at all these forms, you hopefully now have a better idea of what defines them individually, but also the different ways in which they speak to each other, and also the way in which they're defined against each other a lot of the time. So looking at them together, we can see that the art of brevity can be taken in many different directions, and it's closely connected to the aims of the writer, as well as to his or her notions of what literature more broadly is. Well, I've been talking so far particularly about short forms, but what we think of as brevity in literature could also be found in longer works as well. And now I'd like to look at a longer poem by the American writer Emily Dickinson, who I think is a very good example of brevity in literature, a 19th century writer. So let's look at this poem. I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior for doors, of chambers as the cedars, impregnable of eye, and for an everlasting roof, the gambrels of the sky. Of visitors the fairest, for occupation this, the spreading wide my narrow hands to gather paradise. Probably a word that you might not know is gambrel, which is an American word for a sloping type of roof, which is common in America, and particularly in New England, which is where Dickinson is from. And, don't worry if you don't really understand this poem. Dickinson's a famously enigmatic writer. But I'm hoping that what I've been saying about literary brevity is going to give you some way into reading this poem. So I'd like you to just take 5 minutes to read it closely and sort of discuss it with the person next to you, and you think about what it might mean and how the different ideas of literary brevity that we've been looking at might be helping you to read the poem in some way. So if you could just spend 5 minutes doing that, and then I'll say something about it. Okay, I'll have to stop you there, I'm afraid. I don't have time to take feedback from all of you too many, but hopefully you've had a chance to come up with your own ideas and thoughts about the poem. I'll just say a few words about what I myself have noticed in terms of literary brevity specifically. I mean, well, one of the things we considered at the start was how literary brevity could be thought of as compressing a huge amount in a small space. Joubert tried to pack a whole book into a single word, and I think Dickinson can really be thought of in those terms as kind of very condensed writing. And here she seems to be talking about many things at once, doesn't she? She's talking about a house, she's also talking about the natural world, and I think she's also talking about poetry. Did anyone think that? Yeah, so a fairer house than prose we might think of as being poetry. So she's talking here really about the nature of poetry. And another thing we noticed about short form writing is often metaphorical. I think we can think of this as being a kind of extended metaphor for poetry, and for the poet and for the reader of poetry, so that visitor is the fairest, perhaps that's the reader of the poems. Well, if we read it in this way, though, I think we can find that many of the main aspects of literary brevity are ones which Dickinson sees as being fundamental to poetry. The key word here is possibility, I think. I dwell in possibility at the start. And this suggests that the poem is open to endless interpretation. The poet or the reader can enter it through many doors or numerous windows. And the conflation of the narrow confines of the house with the labyrinthine space of a cedar wood and the infinite reaches of the sky suggests that paradoxical combination of smallness and vast space, a lot packed into a small space, which is the mark of many short forms. And this is also captured at the end in the image of the speaker or the poet gathering paradise in her narrow hands, the whole of paradise in her narrow hands. And what Dickinson seems to be saying about poetry here is also reflected in the form of the poem, and indeed in her poetry more generally. For a start, its constrained form, or the metrical pattern, and its limited length echo the confined and structured space of the house with its sloping gambrels. So that idea of constraint in brevity as enabling something. There's a striking feature of Dickinson's work that she uses dashes instead of punctuation marks, and I hope you noticed that about its form. And I think these often function like that cutting word in the haiku, and in fact that cutting word is often translated as a dash, and it wasn't in that one, but it often is. And so, like the haiku, I think it cuts up the text, but it also brings things together. It condenses a lot of different kind of images and phrases, stitches them together. And stitching is made another way of thinking about that dash as a kind of a stitch. So perhaps in light of the poem, we could also think of these dashes as being many windows and doors kind of into and out of the poem. So the dashes have the effect of making the poem read like a series of short texts or fragments condensed together. And I think impregnable of eye, for instance, strikes me as being almost like an independent phrase. And Dickinson's use of capital letters, which is another striking feature of her work, also helps to reinforce that. So almost every capitalised word becomes a kind of fragment on its own. A lot of Dickinson's poems start with a phrase that can easily be detached as a standalone aphorism, and I think that's the case here, isn't it? I dwell in possibility, perhaps in its own, but I dwell in possibility of fairer house than prose is almost like an aphorism. So the rest of the poem can kind of be read as an expansion or development of that aphorism as well. So it's a kind of expanding our understanding of what an aphorism is. Another thing to say about the dash, actually, is the poem ends with a dash, doesn't it, which seems to open it out. So that reflects that idea of possibility as well, sort of opening out of the poem. So in many ways then, Dickinson employs in her poetry a lot of the features of short-form writing. And her ideas about what poetry is also suggest that brevity in literature might in fact be the very thing which distinguishes literature from other kinds of writing or mere prose. So perhaps, in other words, brevity is the very thing which makes poetry poetry, or literature literature. So think about that further, I guess. But I mean, just to conclude, it's probably not surprising really that there's been an explosion of short form writing recently, and I think the internet has a lot to do with that, doesn't it? It really promotes brevity and short forms, things like internet memes, viral videos, tweets, blog posts, text messages, where it's kind of really forced to write briefly and to think briefly a lot of the time, and that's kind of been reflected in a lot of recent literature. How many of you were in the flash fiction course? Did a lot of you do that one? Yeah. So that's another form of short writing, isn't it? And hopefully what I've been saying today might help you to think about that form and other forms of short writing in terms of how you might read and write them. Has anyone read any of these books? The 300 Arguments, Bluets, Replic's Fail? I think these are all good ones to look at if you want to think further about the innovations in short form writing today. I mean, 300 Arguments is quite aphoristic, it calls them arguments, and they tend to have that kind of authoritative tone to them. I mean, Bluets is a series of numbered reflections on the colour blue. It's quite a difficult work to define. It's a quite autobiographical work, quite philosophical as well. And Where Epics Fail is by Yahya Lababidi, who's really an Egyptian-American writer, and he's a leading aphorist today. And he's actually going to be coming to Oxford on the 31st of October, where he's going to be launching this book at the Rollemere American Institute. And I'll be having a conversation with him about this and about aphorisms, a bit of publicity here. And yeah, you'll all be very welcome to come along to that. It's in the Rollemere American Institute. It's free of charge. There's a wine reception, and yes, that's from 5 to 6:30. It's Halloween, and it's the day we're due to crash out of the EU. So if you want to take your mind off of all that, come along and listen to myself and Yahya. I'm also actually organising a conference on the writer Jenny Diski on April the 7th next year. If anyone likes Jenny Diski, that's something else that you might want to come to. I'm teaching in the department. I'm teaching travel literature and Indian literature in English in the coming year. Also teach on the foundation certificate in English literature. I mean, there's loads that we have on offer in English literature and creative writing, different kinds of courses, day schools, online courses, weekly classes, foundation certificate, and so on. So do please look into what's available. And I hope to see you around in the department in the coming year. Yeah, so, okay, I think I shall stop there then. Thank you very much. Yeah.